I had heard the warnings from locals, stories of bear sightings and attacks, but I didn't think it would happen to me. I was prepared, or so I thought. The path was well trodden, the day was warm, and the sun peeked through the canopy overhead. But that moment of peace shattered as a massive form appeared in the shadows. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I knew instantly that it wasn't just another wild animal. It was a predator. My body went into shock as the bear surged toward me, its claws striking with terrifying accuracy. It was a fight I couldn't win, and I was forced to rely on my instincts to survive. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's stories, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to stay updated with future stories. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into the first attack. Barbara Hayes stepped out onto her back porch, inhaling deeply as the crisp Alaskan air filled her lungs. At 65, she still marveled at the beauty of Juneau, even after living here for most of her adult life. The sun peeked through the dense foliage surrounding her modest home, casting dappled shadows across the well-worn wooden deck. Another beautiful day, she murmured to herself, lifting the heavy basket of laundry with practiced ease. Retirement had its perks, and one of them was the luxury of hanging clothes out to dry on days like this. The scent of pine and wildflowers mingled with the fresh linen as she made her way to the clothesline strung between two sturdy poles at the edge of her yard. Barbara hummed softly as she began pinning up sheets and towels, her mind wandering to the plans she had for the day. A quick trip to the grocery store perhaps, and then an afternoon of reading on the porch. Simple pleasures that she had come to cherish in her golden years. As she reached for another clothespin, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sounds of the forest. Birds chirped merrily, and somewhere in the distance a woodpecker drummed out its staccato rhythm. Barbara paused, closing her eyes for a moment to soak it all in. I should call Sarah later, she reminded herself, thinking of her daughter, who lived down in Seattle. It had been a while since they'd caught up, and Barbara missed hearing about her granddaughter's latest adventures in kindergarten. She continued her task, the repetitive motion of hanging clothes soothing in its familiarity. The sun warmed her face, and she tilted her head back, savoring the feeling. It was moments like these that made her grateful for the quiet life she'd built here in Juneau. As she pinned up the last of her husband's flannel shirts, a twig snapped somewhere beyond the tree line. Barbara's hands stilled, the clothespin poised midair. She'd lived in Alaska long enough to know that sound could mean anything from a squirrel to a moose, or something far more dangerous. Slowly, she turned her head towards the source of the noise, her heart beginning to quicken its pace. The dense undergrowth at the edge of her property swayed slightly, and Barbara held her breath, straining her eyes to see what might be lurking there. "Hello?" she called out tentatively, immediately regretting the decision. If it was a harmless animal, she'd just scared it off. If it wasn't, well, she'd just announced her presence to whatever it was. The rustling grew louder, and Barbara took an instinctive step back, her hand clutching the clothespin so tightly her knuckles turned white. She silently berated herself for leaving her phone in the house, a habit she'd developed to enjoy the peace and quiet without interruption. Suddenly, the underbrush parted, and Barbara found herself face to face with a massive black bear. Time seemed to stand still as they regarded each other, neither moving a muscle. The bear's dark eyes, intelligent and curious, locked onto hers. Barbara's mind raced, trying to remember everything she'd learned about bear encounters over the years. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Speak calmly, but firmly. But in that moment, frozen in fear, all she could do was stare. The bear sniffed the air, its wet nose twitching. It took a lumbering step forward, and Barbara felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew black bears weren't typically aggressive, but this close, its size was terrifying. It could easily outweigh her by hundreds of pounds. "Easy there, big fella," Barbara managed to croak out, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't want any trouble, and neither do I." The bear tilted its head, almost as if it was considering her words. For a brief moment, Barbara allowed herself to hope that it might simply turn and amble back into the woods. But then, without warning, The bear dropped to all fours and charged. Barbara's world exploded into chaos. She felt rather than saw the impact as the bear knocked her off her feet. The ground rushed up to meet her, knocking the wind from her lungs. Pain shot through her body as she hit the earth, the bear's weight pressing down on her. "Help!" she screamed, though she knew it was futile. Her nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and the trees muffled sound. "Somebody help me!" The bear's hot breath washed over her face, reeking of wild things and decay. Barbara squeezed her eyes shut, certain that at any moment she'd feel the creature's teeth tear into her flesh. But instead she felt its rough tongue lick her cheek almost curiously. Opening her eyes, Barbara found herself staring directly into the bear's face, mere inches from her own. Its eyes seemed to study her, and in that moment, Barbara was struck by how beautiful and terrifying nature could be all at once. "Please," she whispered, not sure if she was addressing the bear or some higher power. "Please don't hurt me." As if in response, the bear shifted its weight, allowing Barbara to draw in a shuddering breath. She knew she should try to fight back, to make noise, to do something, anything, to drive the animal away. But fear had paralyzed her, leaving her at the mercy of this wild creature. The bear sniffed at her again, its nose pressing against her neck. Barbara could feel its coarse fur against her skin, could hear the low rumble in its chest. She braced herself for pain, for the end, silently apologizing to her family for the grief they would endure. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear backed away. It rose onto its hind legs, towering over Barbara's prone form. For a long moment it stood there, swaying slightly as it looked down at her. Then, with a huff that almost sounded dismissive, it dropped back to all fours and lumbered towards the woods. Barbara lay there, hardly daring to breathe as she watched the bear disappear into the underbrush. The entire encounter had lasted maybe 2 minutes, but to her, it felt like an eternity. As the adrenaline began to ebb, she became aware of a throbbing pain in her ankle and a stinging sensation on her arms where the bear's claws had grazed her. Gingerly, she pushed herself up into a sitting position, wincing at the pain that shot through her body. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and she could see angry red scratches on her forearms. But she was alive. Somehow, miraculously, she was alive. With trembling hands, Barbara touched her face where the bear had licked her. The saliva was already drying, leaving behind a tacky residue that made her skin crawl. She looked around at the scattered laundry, at the perfect normalcy of her backyard, and felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat. "Oh God," she choked out, the laugh turning into a sob. "Oh God." Slowly, painfully, Barbara got to her feet. Her ankle protested as she put weight on it, and she realized it was likely sprained. Limping heavily, she made her way back to the house, casting fearful glances over her shoulder with every step. Once inside, she locked the door with shaking hands and collapsed onto a kitchen chair. The familiar surroundings of her home felt surreal after what had just happened. Barbara reached for the phone, dialing 911 with numb fingers. As she waited for the operator to pick up, her eyes drifted to the window, to the woods beyond. The bear was out there somewhere, going about its day as if it hadn't just turned her world upside down. Barbara shuddered, realizing that her quiet life in Juneau would never quite be the same again. 911. "What's your emergency?" The operator's voice jolted Barbara back to the present. I've been attacked by a bear," she said, her own voice sounding strange and distant to her ears. "In my backyard. I need help." As she gave her address and answered the operator's questions, Barbara couldn't shake the feeling that she had glimpsed something primal and terrifying. A reminder that no matter how civilized we think we are, nature always has the upper hand. And sometimes it comes right up to your clothesline to prove it. The world spun as Barbara hit the ground, the bear's massive form looming over her. Pain exploded through her body, radiating from her back where she'd struck the earth. For a moment she couldn't breathe, the impact having knocked the wind out of her lungs. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, everything came into sharp focus. The bear's weight pressed down on her chest, making each breath a struggle. Its hot, rancid breath washed over her face as it sniffed her, curious and menacing all at once. "Oh God, oh God," Barbara gasped, her voice barely a whisper. She tried to remember everything she'd ever learned about bear encounters. But panic was setting in, clouding her thoughts. The bear shifted and Barbara felt a searing pain as its claws dug into her flesh. She cried out, the sound seeming to startle the animal. It pulled back slightly, its dark eyes fixed on her face. "Help!" Barbara screamed, though she knew it was futile. Her nearest neighbor, old Mr. Johnson, was too far away to hear. "Somebody help me!" The bear's head swung from side to side, as if searching for the source of the noise. Barbara seized the moment to try and catch her breath, her chest heaving with each painful inhalation. "Okay, Barbara, think," she muttered to herself, struggling to stay calm. "You're a nurse. You've handled emergencies before. This is just a really big, furry emergency." The absurdity of the thought almost made her laugh, but the sound caught in her throat as the bear's attention snapped back to her. Its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed teeth that looked all too capable of tearing her apart. Barbara's hands scrabbled at the ground, desperately searching for anything she could use to defend herself. Her fingers found only grass and dirt, tearing at the earth in her panic. "Nice bear," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't want to eat me, I'm all tough and stringy. Probably tastes terrible." The bear tilted its head, almost as if it was considering her words. For a brief, absurd moment, Barbara wondered if it could understand her. Then it let out a low growl that vibrated through her entire body, and she knew it didn't matter. This wasn't a creature that could be reasoned with. Pain exploded through Barbara's arm as the bear's claws raked across it. She screamed, the sound primal and filled with terror. The bear reared back, startled by the noise, and Barbara saw her chance. With strength born of desperation, she pushed against the bear's chest. "Get off me!" she yelled, her voice hoarse and raw. To her surprise, the bear stumbled backward, giving her a moment's reprieve. Barbara scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain that shot through her ankle. She knew she couldn't outrun the bear, but maybe she could make it to the house. She had barely taken 2 steps when the bear recovered, lunging at her with a roar that seemed to shake the very air. Barbara threw herself to the side, feeling the rush of air as the bear's massive paw swung past her face. She hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact as best she could. Her nursing training kicked in, helping her protect her head and vital organs. But nothing had prepared her for the sheer terror of being hunted. The bear circled her, its movements deliberate and predatory. Barbara pushed herself up onto her elbows, wincing at the pain. She could feel warm blood trickling down her arm where the bear had clawed her. "You don't want to do this," she said, locking eyes with the bear. "We can both walk away. No harm, no foul." The bear's only response was another growl, low and menacing. It took a step towards her and Barbara tensed, ready to make another desperate attempt to escape. Just then a loud crash came from the direction of her house. Both Barbara and the bear turned to look. There, on her back porch, stood Mr. Johnson, banging a metal pot with a wooden spoon. "Hey, get away from her, you overgrown fur coat!" The old man yelled, his voice cracking with age but still forceful. The bear hesitated, caught between its prey and this new threat. Barbara seized the moment, summoning every ounce of strength she had left. "Get out of here!" she screamed, waving her arms wildly despite the pain. "Go on, get!" The combination of Barbara's sudden movement and Mr. Johnson's continued racket seemed to confuse the bear. It took a step back, then another, its eyes darting between the two humans. "That's right, you big bully," Mr. Johnson shouted, hobbling down the porch steps with surprising speed for a man in his 80s. "Go on back to the woods where you belong." The bear let out a final frustrated roar before turning and lumbering towards the tree line. Barbara watched it go, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She didn't dare move until the bear had disappeared into the underbrush. "Barbara, you all right, girl?" Mr. Johnson called, hurrying towards her as fast as his arthritic knees would allow. The adrenaline that had been keeping Barbara going suddenly drained away, leaving her weak and shaking. I don't know," she managed to say before collapsing back onto the grass. Mr. Johnson reached her side, kneeling down with a grunt of effort. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he muttered, taking in her injuries. "What were you thinking, tangoing with a bear? Despite everything, Barbara found herself chuckling weakly. Wasn't exactly my idea of a dance partner, Joe. Well, you're lucky I forgot my hearing aid at home last night, Mr. Johnson said, helping her sit up. Came over to ask if you'd seen it. Heard the commotion from down the road. Barbara winced as she tried to move her arm. I've never been so happy about your forgetfulness, she said. Then more seriously, thank you, Joe. You saved my life. The old man waved off her thanks with a gruff sound. Ah, well, couldn't let that walking rug use you as a chew toy, could I? Now let's get you inside and call for help. You're bleeding all over your nice clean laundry. As Mr. Johnson helped her to her feet, Barbara cast one last glance at the woods. The bear was gone, but she could still feel its presence, as if it had left an invisible mark on her and her home. I don't think I'll be hanging laundry out here for a while, she murmured. Damn right you won't, Mr. Johnson agreed, supporting her as they slowly made their way to the house. From now on, you do your laundry inside like a civilized person. Leave the great outdoors to the critters. Barbara nodded, too exhausted and in too much pain to argue. As they reached the porch, she paused, looking back at her yard. The scattered laundry, the overturned basket, the patches of earth torn up by her struggle. It all seemed surreal now, like a scene from a movie rather than her own backyard. Joe, she said quietly, do you think it'll come back? The old man was silent for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Can't say for sure, he finally replied. But I reckon it got enough of a scare to think twice about it. And if it does, he added with a wink, I'll be ready with my pot and spoon. Despite everything, Barbara felt a smile tugging at her lips. My hero, she said, giving his arm a gentle squeeze. As they entered the house, Barbara knew that her quiet life had been irrevocably changed. The attack had lasted only minutes, but its effects would linger far longer. She glanced at her reflection in the hallway mirror, taking in her disheveled appearance and the wild look in her eyes. You're alive, Barbara, she told her reflection firmly. You survived. Remember that. With Mr. Johnson's help, she made her way to the kitchen to call for help. As she dialed 911, Barbara silently vowed that she wouldn't let this experience define her. She had faced death and come out the other side. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same strength and determination that had kept her alive in those terrifying moments with the bear. The operator's voice came on the line, calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? Barbara took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in her ribs. I've been attacked by a bear in my backyard, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I need medical assistance. As she gave her address and answered the operator's questions, Barbara felt a strange mix of fear, relief, and determination. The quiet life she had known was gone, but she was still here, still fighting. And that, she realized, was what truly mattered. Barbara's entire body screamed in protest as she scrambled backward, her hands and feet digging into the soft earth. Every movement sent waves of pain through her, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins pushed her onward. She could hear her own ragged breathing, punctuated by the angry growls of the bear just a few feet away. Come on, Barbara, move, she urged herself, her voice a strained whisper. She glanced over her shoulder, gauging the distance to her house. It seemed impossibly far away, a sanctuary just out of reach. The bear's roar shattered the air, causing birds to take flight from nearby trees. The sound galvanized Barbara into action. With a grunt of pain, she forced herself to her feet, swaying unsteadily, as she put weight on her injured ankle. Oh God, she panted, limping as fast as she could toward the house. Each step was agony, but the alternative, staying put and becoming bear food, was unthinkable. Behind her, she could hear the bear's heavy footfalls, twigs snapping under its weight as it gave chase. Barbara didn't dare look back, focusing all her energy on her escape. Her legs felt like lead, muscles burning with exertion and fear. Help! She cried out, though she knew it was futile. Her nearest neighbor, Mr. Johnson, had already gone back to his house to call for help. She was on her own. The sound of the bear's breathing grew closer, spurring Barbara to push herself harder. She could see her back porch now, the screen door slightly ajar where Mr. Johnson had left it in his haste to grab his noise-making pot and spoon. Almost there, Barbara gasped, her vision blurring with tears of pain and fear. Come on, just a little further. She stumbled on the uneven ground, crying out as her ankle twisted, For a heart-stopping moment, she thought she would fall, imagining the bear's claws tearing into her back. But somehow she managed to keep her footing, lurching forward with renewed desperation. The bear's hot breath seemed to tickle the back of her neck, though Barbara couldn't be sure if it was real or just her terrified imagination. She could almost feel its presence looming behind her, ready to strike at any moment. With a final burst of speed that she didn't know she possessed, Barbara reached the porch steps. She practically threw herself up them, her hands grasping wildly for the railing to pull herself along. "Please, please," she whimpered, reaching for the screen door. Her blood-slicked hands slipped on the handle, and for a moment of pure terror, she thought she wouldn't be able to open it. The bear's roar sounded again, closer than ever. Barbara could hear its claws scrabbling on the wooden steps behind her. In a panic, she yanked hard on the door handle, nearly sobbing with relief as it swung open. She half fell, half stumbled into the house, spinning around to slam the door shut. Through the screen, she could see the bear, massive and terrifying, its dark eyes fixed on her as it reached the top of the steps. "No, no, no," Barbara moaned, fumbling with the lock. Her trembling fingers finally managed to slide it into place just as the bear rammed into the door. The thin frame shuddered with the impact, and Barbara stumbled backward, certain it would give way. But the door held. The bear growled in frustration, rising onto its hind legs to peer through the screen at her. Barbara backed away, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Go away," she said, her voice hoarse and barely audible. "Please, just go away." For what felt like an eternity, the bear stood there swaying slightly as it watched her. Barbara held her breath, afraid that even the slightest movement might provoke it to renew its attack. Then, with a final huff that sounded almost dismissive, the bear dropped back to all fours and lumbered off the porch. Barbara didn't move, until she saw it disappear into the trees at the edge of her yard. Only then did she allow herself to collapse, sliding down the wall to sit on the floor. The adrenaline that had kept her going began to ebb, leaving her shaking and nauseous. "I made it," she whispered, hardly believing it herself. "I actually made it." As the immediate danger passed, the full extent of her injuries made itself known. Her ankle throbbed mercilessly, and she could feel warm blood trickling from the claw marks on her arms and back. Every breath sent a stab of pain through her ribs, and she wondered if one might be cracked. With trembling hands, Barbara reached for the phone on the small table near the door. She needed to call 911 to get help, but as she lifted the receiver, she realized she couldn't remember the number. Her mind felt foggy, shock setting in as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. "Come on, Barbara," she muttered to herself. "You're a nurse, you know what to do in an emergency." Taking a deep breath, wincing at the pain it caused, Barbara forced herself to focus. She dialed 911, leaving bloody smears on the buttons. As she waited for someone to pick up, she looked down at herself, really taking in her condition for the first time. Her clothes were torn and dirty, streaked with blood and grass stains. Through the rips in her shirt, she could see angry red scratches where the bear's claws had caught her. Her hands were scraped raw from her desperate crawl across the ground. 911, what's your emergency?" The operator's calm voice jolted Barbara back to the present. I've been attacked by a bear," Barbara said, her own voice sounding strange and distant to her ears. "In my backyard, I managed to get inside, but I'm hurt. I need help." "Ma'am, can you tell me your location?" the operator asked, her tone professional but tinged with concern. Barbara gave her address, then answered a series of questions about her injuries and whether the bear was still in the area. As she spoke, she pressed a dish towel she'd grabbed from the kitchen counter to one of the deeper cuts on her arm, watching as the white fabric quickly turned red. "An ambulance is on its way, ma'am," the operator assured her. "Is there someone who can stay with you until they arrive?" Barbara was about to say no when she remembered Mr. Johnson. "My neighbor," she said. "He helped scare the bear away earlier. He went home to call for help, but he might come back to check on me." As if on cue, she heard a knock at the front door. "Barbara, you in there, girl?" Mr. Johnson's gruff voice called out. "I'm here, Joe," she called back, her voice cracking. "Come in, it's unlocked." She heard the front door open and close, followed by the uneven steps of Mr. Johnson's approach. He appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, his weathered face paling as he took in her condition. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he muttered, hurrying to her side as fast as his arthritic knees would allow. "You look like you went 10 rounds with a lawnmower. Despite everything." Barbara found herself chuckling weakly at his description. "Feels like it too," she admitted. Mr. Johnson knelt beside her with a grunt of effort, his eyes scanning her injuries with concern. "Ambulance on its way?" he asked, and Barbara nodded. "Good," he said, patting her hand gently. "You just hang in there, Barbara. You're tougher than any old bear, you hear me?" As the shock began to wear off, replaced by a bone-deep weariness, Barbara leaned against her old friend's shoulder. "I was so scared, Joe," she whispered, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I thought I was going to die out there." Mr. Johnson wrapped an arm around her, careful to avoid her injuries. "But you didn't," he said firmly. "You fought and you won. Remember that, Barbara? You're a survivor." They sat there together, waiting for the ambulance to arrive. Barbara could hear the bear's angry growls echoing in her mind, could still feel the phantom weight of its body pressing down on her. She knew those sensations would haunt her for a long time to come, but as she sat there, battered and bloody but alive, Barbara felt a glimmer of something else beneath the fear and pain, a steely determination, a will to live that had carried her through the most terrifying moments of her life. She had faced nature at its most primal and come out the other side. As the distant wail of sirens reached her ears, Barbara took a shaky breath. "You're right, Joe," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I am a survivor, and I'm not about to let a bear take that away from me." Mr. Johnson squeezed her shoulder gently. "That's the spirit, girl," he said with a proud smile. "Now let's get you patched up so you can tell everyone how you outran a bear in your own backyard. That'll be a story for the grandkids, won't it?" Barbara managed a small smile, grateful for her friend's attempt to lighten the mood. As the ambulance pulled up outside, lights flashing, she steeled herself for what was to come. The ordeal wasn't over. There would be hospital visits, possibly surgery, and a long recovery ahead. But she had survived the attack, had found strength she didn't know she possessed. Whatever came next, Barbara knew she would face it head-on, just as she had faced down the bear. She was battered but not broken, and as the paramedics rushed in, their voices a blur of professional concern, Barbara held onto that thought like a lifeline. She was a survivor, and this was just the beginning of her story. Barbara's hands trembled uncontrollably as she dialed 911, her blood-slicked fingers leaving crimson smears on the phone's keypad. The adrenaline that had fueled her escape was rapidly fading, replaced by waves of pain and growing shock. 911, what's your emergency?" The operator's voice sounded distant and tinny through the receiver. I've been attacked by a bear," Barbara managed to say, her own voice sounding strange to her ears. "In my backyard. I'm inside now, but I'm hurt. Ma'am, can you give me your address?" The operator's tone was calm and professional, a stark contrast to the chaos of Barbara's emotions. Barbara rattled off her address, her words slurring slightly as shock began to set in. She could hear the operator asking more questions, but her attention was drawn to the blood slowly pooling on the kitchen floor beneath her. "Ma'am, are you still there?" The operator's voice cut through the fog in Barbara's mind. "Yes, I'm here," she replied, shaking her head to clear it. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" "I asked about your injuries. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" Barbara looked down at herself, really taking stock of her condition for the first time. My arms are cut up pretty bad, and my ankle, I think it might be sprained. My ribs hurt when I breathe." As she spoke, Barbara reached for a dish towel hanging nearby, pressing it against one of the deeper gashes on her arm. She watched, with a detached fascination as the white fabric quickly turned red. "Okay, ma'am. I've dispatched an ambulance to your location. They should be there in about 10 minutes. Is there someone who can stay with you until they arrive?" Barbara was about to say no when she remembered Mr. Johnson. "My neighbor," she said. "He helped scare the bear away earlier. He went home to call for help, but he might come back." As if on cue, she heard a knock at the front door. "Barbara, you in there, girl?" Mr. Johnson's gruff voice called out. "He's here," Barbara told the operator, relief washing over her. "My neighbor's here. That's good. I'm going to stay on the line with you until the ambulance arrives, okay? Barbara nodded, then realized the operator couldn't see her. Okay, she said aloud. Then, raising her voice, she called out to Mr. Johnson. I'm in the kitchen, Joe. Come in. She heard the front door open and close, followed by the uneven steps of Mr. Johnson's approach. He appeared in the doorway, his weathered face paling as he took in her condition. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, he muttered, hurrying to her side as fast as his arthritic knees would allow. You look like you went 10 rounds with a wood chipper. Despite everything, Barbara found herself chuckling weakly at his description. The laugh quickly turned into a groan as pain shot through her ribs. Mr. Johnson knelt beside her with a grunt of effort, his eyes scanning her injuries with concern. Ambulance on its way? He asked, and Barbara nodded. They're on the line, now, she said, gesturing to the phone. Mr. Johnson gently took the receiver from her shaking hand. This is Joe Johnson, he said into the phone. I'm Barbara's neighbor. What can I do to help? As Mr. Johnson listened to the operator's instructions, Barbara leaned back against the kitchen cabinet, suddenly feeling very tired. The room seemed to be spinning slightly, and she closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. Barbara? Mr. Johnson's voice sounded far away. Barbara, stay with me now. The nice lady on the phone says you need to stay awake. Barbara forced her eyes open, focusing on her friend's concerned face. I'm awake, she mumbled. Just tired. I know, girl, but you gotta stay with us. Here, let's get you more comfortable. With surprising gentleness for a man his age, Mr. Johnson helped Barbara shift into a more upright position. He pressed a clean towel to the wound on her arm, replacing the blood-soaked one. Talk to me, Barbara, he urged. Tell me what happened out there. Barbara took a shaky breath, wincing at the pain in her ribs. I was hanging laundry, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. It came out of nowhere, Joe. 1 minute I was pinning up sheets, the next. She trailed off, the memory of the bear's hot breath on her face suddenly vivid in her mind. Mr. Johnson squeezed her hand gently, encouraging her to continue. It was so big, Barbara said, her eyes unfocused, as she relived the moment. I've seen bears before, but never this close. Never like this. As she spoke, recounting the terrifying moments of the attack and her desperate escape, Barbara felt the room start to spin again. The pain in her body seemed to intensify, and she could feel herself starting to slip away. Joe, she said, her voice faint. I don't feel so good. Mr. Johnson's face swam in her vision, his expression alarmed. Barbara? Barbara, stay with me now. The ambulance is almost here. But his voice was fading, replaced by a rushing sound in her ears. Barbara felt herself slipping into darkness, the kitchen fading away around her. She drifted in and out of awareness, catching snippets of conversation and flashes of movement. At one point, she thought she heard sirens, then unfamiliar voices asking questions she couldn't quite understand. Female, mid-60s, bear attack victim. Multiple lacerations, possible fractured ribs. Signs of shock. Barbara felt herself being lifted, the movement sending fresh waves of pain through her body. She tried to open her eyes, to speak, but couldn't seem to make her body obey. Hang in there, ma'am. We're taking you to the hospital now. The next thing Barbara was aware of was bright lights above her, moving rapidly as she was wheeled down what she assumed was a hospital corridor. Faces appeared and disappeared from her field of vision, voices calling out medical jargon she recognized from her years as a nurse. Get her into Trauma 1. I want a full set of labs, chest x-ray, and prep for possible surgery. Barbara wanted to tell them she was okay, that they didn't need to worry so much. But the words wouldn't come. She felt a mask being placed over her face, the hiss of oxygen filling her ears. Barbara, can you hear me? I'm Dr. Patel. You're at Bartlett Regional Hospital. We're going to take good care of you, okay? She managed a small nod, relief washing over her at being in familiar surroundings. Bartlett Regional was where she had worked for over 3 decades before retiring. She was home, in a way. As the medical team worked around her, Barbara felt herself starting to drift again. The pain was fading, replaced by a fuzzy warmth that she recognized as the effects of pain medication. Just before she slipped into unconsciousness, Barbara had a sudden vivid image of the bear. But this time, instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of awe. She had faced one of nature's most powerful creatures and survived. Whatever came next, she knew she could handle it. With that thought, Barbara let herself slip into the darkness, trusting in the care of her colleagues and friends. The beeping of monitors and the murmur of voices faded away, replaced by a deep, healing sleep. The aftermath of the attack was just beginning, but Barbara Hayes, retired nurse and newly minted bear attack survivor, was ready to face it head-on. Bright lights assaulted Barbara's eyes as she was wheeled into the emergency room of Bartlett Regional Hospital. The fluorescent glare seemed to pierce through her eyelids, intensifying the pounding in her head. Voices swirled around her, a cacophony of medical jargon and urgent commands. Bear attack victim, multiple lacerations, possible fractured ribs, signs of shock. Barbara tried to focus on the faces above her, but they blurred into a confusing kaleidoscope of movement and color. She recognized the general layout of the ER. After all, she had spent decades of her life working in this very hospital. But now as a patient, everything seemed alien and overwhelming. "Barbara, can you hear me?" A face swam into focus above her. It took her a moment to recognize Dr. Sarah Chen, a young physician she had mentored before her retirement. "Barbara, you're at Bartlett Regional. We're going to take good care of you, okay?" Barbara tried to nod, but even that small movement sent waves of pain through her body. She managed a weak groan instead. "Get her into Trauma 1, Dr. Chen ordered. I want a full set of labs, chest x-ray, and someone page Dr. Ramirez from Ortho for that ankle." As they wheeled her into the trauma bay, Barbara felt a surge of panic. The beeping of monitors, the rustle of sterile packaging being opened, the sharp smell of antiseptic. It was all too familiar, yet terrifyingly different from this side of the gurney. "We're going to cut your clothes off now, Barbara," a nurse explained gently. "We need to assess your injuries." Cold scissors slid against her skin, and Barbara shivered. As they peeled away the blood-soaked fabric, she heard sharp intakes of breath from the medical team. "Jesus," someone muttered. "That bear did a number on her." "All right, let's clean these wounds." Dr. Chen's voice cut through the chatter. "Barbara, I'm going to give you something for the pain now. You might feel a little drowsy." Barbara felt a cool rush in her arm as the medication entered her IV. The pain began to recede, replaced by a floating sensation that was not entirely unpleasant. "Barbara?" Dr. Chen's face appeared above her again. "We need to clean and suture your wounds. Some of these cuts are quite deep, do you understand?" Barbara nodded, the movement easier now that the pain was dulled. "Do what you need to do, Sarah," she managed to say, her voice raspy and weak. As the team worked, Barbara drifted in and out of awareness. The pain would spike occasionally, causing her to gasp or cry out, only to be quickly tamped down by additional medication. "Multiple lacerations on the arms and back," she heard Dr. Chen dictating. "Largest approximately 15 centimeters on the left forearm, requiring deep sutures. Probable fractured ribs on the left side, awaiting X-ray confirmation. Severe sprain of the right ankle, possible torn ligaments." Barbara's mind wandered as they worked. She could see the bear in her mind's eye, its massive form looming over her, its hot breath on her face. She whimpered, trying to push the image away. "It's okay, Barbara," a nurse soothed, mistaking her distress for physical pain. "We're almost done with the sutures." Time seemed to stretch and warp. Barbara wasn't sure how long she had been in the ER when she heard a commotion at the door. "Ma'am, you can't go in there right now," someone was saying. "The hell I can't," came a familiar voice. "That's my mother in there." Barbara's heart leapt. "Sarah?" she called out weakly. Dr. Chen looked up from her work, then nodded to one of the nurses. "Let her in," she said. But just for a moment, Sarah Hayes burst into the room, her face pale with worry. She gasped when she saw her mother, tears welling up in her eyes. "Mom," she choked out. "Oh my God, Mom." "I'm okay, sweetheart." Barbara tried to reassure her, though she knew she looked far from okay. "It looks worse than it is." Sarah took her hand, careful to avoid the IV lines. "Dad's on his way," she said. "He was out on the boat when I got the call." "What happened, Mom? They said something about a bear?" Barbara nodded, wincing as the movement sent a stab of pain through her head. In the backyard, she said. I was hanging laundry. Ms. Hayes, Dr. Chen interrupted gently. I'm sorry, but we need to take your mother for some x-rays now. You can see her again once we've finished our assessment. Sarah nodded, reluctantly, letting go of her mother's hand. I'll be right outside, Mom, she promised. I love you. Love you too, honey, Barbara managed to say before they wheeled her out of the room. The next few hours passed in a blur of tests, scans, and consultations. Barbara was poked, prodded, and positioned more times than she could count. The pain medication made everything hazy, but couldn't completely dull the constant ache in her body. Finally, she found herself in a private room, the beeping of monitors a constant reminder of her situation. Dr. Chen came in, looking tired but satisfied. Well, Barbara, she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. You've certainly had quite a day. Want to hear the damage report? Barbara nodded, steeling herself for the news. You've got 3 fractured ribs on your left side, Dr. Chen began. Fortunately, they're clean breaks and should heal well with time and rest. Your right ankle is severely sprained, but there's no fracture or torn ligaments, which is good news. We've sutured multiple lacerations, the deepest being on your left forearm. You'll have some impressive scars to show for this adventure. She paused, her expression growing more serious. The main concern right now is infection. Bear attacks carry a high risk of bacterial contamination. We've started you on broad-spectrum antibiotics and we'll be monitoring you closely for any signs of infection. Barbara nodded, processing the information. How long will I need to stay? She asked. At least a few days, Dr. Chen replied. We want to make sure the antibiotics are working and that there are no complications from your injuries. After that, you'll need several weeks of rest and rehabilitation. As if on cue, a nurse appeared at the door. Dr. Chen, Ms. Hayes' family is here. They're asking to see her. Dr. Chen smiled. I think we can allow that now, but not too many at once and not for too long. You need your rest, Barbara. As the doctor left, Barbara's husband John and daughter Sarah entered the room. John's weathered face was etched with worry, his eyes red-rimmed as if he'd been crying. Barb, he said, his voice cracking as he took her hand. Oh, Barb, I'm... Okay, John, she assured him, squeezing his hand weakly. I'm okay. Sarah stood at the foot of the bed, her eyes taking in every bandage, every tube, every monitor. Mom, she said softly. What were you thinking, taking on a bear like that? Despite everything, Barbara found herself chuckling, then wincing, as the movement jarred her ribs. Wasn't exactly my idea, sweetie, she said. But I showed that bear a thing or two, didn't I? John shook his head, a mix of exasperation and relief on his face. Only you, Barb, he said. Only you could joke about something like this. As her family settled in around her, Barbara felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The events of the day seemed almost unreal now, like a vivid and terrifying dream. But the pain in her body and the worried faces of her loved ones were stark reminders of the reality of what had happened. She closed her eyes, listening to the soft murmur of her family's voices and the steady beep of the heart monitor. The bear's roar still echoed in her mind, but it seemed distant now, muffled by the warmth and safety of the hospital room. As she drifted off to sleep, Barbara knew that her recovery would be long and challenging, but she had survived the unthinkable. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same strength and determination that had kept her alive in those terrifying moments with the bear. The quiet life she had known was gone, replaced by a new reality of hospital stays, rehabilitation, and a newfound respect for the wild world just beyond her backyard. But Barbara Hayes was still here, still fighting. And that, she realized as sleep finally claimed her, was what truly mattered. Barbara stood at her front door, key in hand, frozen in place. After a week in the hospital and another 2 weeks at her daughter Sarah's house in Juneau, she was finally back home. But now, faced with the prospect of stepping inside, she found herself hesitating. Mom? Sarah's voice came from behind her, concern evident in her tone. Are you okay? Barbara took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the twinge in her still healing ribs. I'm fine, honey, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Just taking a moment. She could feel Sarah's worried gaze on her back. Her daughter had been hovering constantly since the attack, treating Barbara like she might shatter at any moment. While Barbara appreciated the care, a part of her longed for normalcy. With a determined nod, Barbara inserted the key and turned it. The familiar click of the lock seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet of the afternoon. Slowly, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house looked exactly as she had left it that fateful day, save for the new screen door her husband John had installed while she was in the hospital. Barbara's eyes were immediately drawn to the kitchen, where she had collapsed after her desperate escape from the bear. There was no sign of the blood that had pooled on the floor. John had scrubbed it clean, but she could still see it, in her mind's eye. "Welcome home, Mom," Sarah said softly, following her inside with Barbara's bag. "Do you want to sit down? You must be tired from the drive." Barbara shook her head. "No, I think I'll walk around a bit, reacquaint myself with the place." She moved through the house slowly, her hand trailing along familiar surfaces. Everything looked the same, felt the same, but Barbara couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. It wasn't the house that was different, she realized, it was her. As she reached the living room, Barbara's eyes were drawn to the large window overlooking the backyard. She approached it cautiously, her heart rate picking up as she peered out at the scene of her attack. The yard looked peaceful in the afternoon sun. John had picked up the scattered laundry and righted the overturned basket. The clothesline stood empty, swaying gently in the breeze. There was no sign of the violence that had occurred there just weeks ago. "Mom?" Sarah's voice startled Barbara, making her jump. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. Are you sure you're okay?" Barbara turned to her daughter, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, sweetie, just remembering." Sarah's face softened with understanding. "It's okay to be scared, Mom. After what you went through." "I'm not scared," Barbara interrupted, perhaps too quickly. Seeing the doubt on Sarah's face, she sighed. "Okay, maybe a little, but I'll be fine. This is my home, and I won't let that bear take it from me." Sarah nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. "Well, I'll be staying for a few days to help out. And Dad will be back from his fishing trip tomorrow. You won't be alone." Barbara felt a mix of gratitude and frustration at her daughter's words. She appreciated the support, but a part of her bristled at the implication that she needed constant supervision. "Thank you, honey," she said, patting Sarah's arm. "But I think I'd like to rest now. Why don't you go grab some groceries? I'm sure the fridge is empty after being away so long." Sarah hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her mother alone. "Are you sure? I can stay if you want company." "I'm sure," Barbara said firmly. "Some quiet time would do me good." After a few more reassurances, Sarah finally left, promising to be back soon. As the door closed behind her daughter, Barbara let out a long breath. The silence of the empty house pressed in around her. She made her way to the kitchen, intent on making a cup of tea. As she filled the kettle, a movement outside the window caught her eye. Barbara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. But it was just a squirrel scampering across the yard. "Get a grip, Barbara," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. With her tea in hand, Barbara settled into her favorite armchair, angled to face the backyard. She sipped the hot liquid slowly, her eyes scanning the tree line. The rational part of her mind knew that the bear was long gone, likely miles away, in the Alaskan wilderness. But she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the afternoon wore on, Barbara found herself jumping at every little sound: the creak of the house settling, the wind rustling through the trees, a car passing on the distant road. Each noise sent her heart racing, her mind immediately conjuring images of the bear returning to finish what it had started. "This is ridiculous," she said aloud, setting her empty cup down with more force than necessary. "You're a grown woman, Barbara Hayes. You face down cranky doctors, difficult patients, and yes, even a bear. You will not let fear rule your life." With newfound determination, Barbara stood and made her way to the back door. She hesitated for just a moment before grasping the handle and stepping out onto the porch. The fresh air hit her like a wave, carrying with it the scents of pine and wildflowers. Barbara took a deep breath, savoring the familiar smells of home. She scanned the yard, half expecting to see the bear lumbering out of the trees. But there was nothing, just the gentle sway of grass in the breeze and birds flitting between branches. Slowly, Barbara descended the porch steps. Her ankle, still tender from the sprain, protested slightly, but she pushed on. She made her way across the yard, retracing the path she had taken during her desperate escape. When she reached the spot where she had first encountered the bear, Barbara paused. "You don't own this place," she said softly, addressing the absent bear and her own fears in equal measure. "This is my home, and I won't let you take it from me." As if in response to her words, a gust of wind swept through the yard, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver down Barbara's spine. For a moment, she could almost feel the bear's hot breath on her face again, could almost hear its low growl. But then the moment passed and Barbara was left standing alone in her peaceful backyard. She took another deep breath, feeling some of the tension leave her body. It would take time, she knew, to fully reclaim her sense of safety, but this was a start. As she turned to head back to the house, Barbara caught sight of something glinting in the grass. Curious, she bent down to investigate, wincing slightly at the pull on her healing ribs. There, half buried in the dirt, was one of her clothespins, a small mundane object that had survived the chaos of the attack. Barbara picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was such a simple thing, but it represented the normal, peaceful life she had lived before the bear, the life she was determined to reclaim. With the clothespin clutched in her hand like a talisman, Barbara made her way back to the house. As she reached the porch, she heard Sarah's car pulling into the driveway. For the first time since returning home, Barbara felt a genuine smile spread across her face. She may still have a long way to go, but standing there in her backyard, facing her fears head-on, Barbara knew she was on the right path. The bear had taken much from her, her sense of safety, her physical well-being for a time, but it hadn't taken her strength or her determination. As Sarah approached, arms full of grocery bags, Barbara held up the clothespin. "I think I'm ready to do some laundry," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Sarah's surprised laugh was like music to Barbara's ears. "One step at a time, Mom," she said, shaking her head in fond exasperation. "How about we start with dinner?" Barbara nodded, following her daughter inside. The house no longer felt alien or threatening. It was home again, bear or no bear. And Barbara Hayes was home too, battered but not broken, ready to face whatever came next. A week after her return home, Barbara sat in the small office of Jack Wheeler, the local wildlife officer for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. The room was cluttered with maps, wildlife pamphlets, and a few mounted animal heads that made Barbara slightly uncomfortable. She shifted in her chair, wincing as her still healing ribs protested the movement. "So, Mrs. Hayes," Officer Wheeler began, his pen poised over a notepad, "why don't you walk me through what happened that day?" Barbara took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had recounted the story numerous times, to her family, to hospital staff, to friends who called to check on her. But this was different. This was official. "I was hanging laundry in my backyard," she began, her voice steady. "It was a beautiful day, quiet. I didn't hear anything unusual until—" As Barbara recounted the events of the attack, she watched Officer Wheeler's face carefully. His expression remained neutral, his pen scratching across the paper as he took notes. When she finished, he looked up, his brow furrowed slightly. "And you're certain it was a black bear?" he asked. Barbara nodded firmly. "Yes, I'm sure. I've lived in Alaska most of my life, Officer Wheeler. I know what a black bear looks like." Wheeler made another note. "It's just that black bears aren't typically aggressive towards humans unless provoked. Was there any food in your yard that might have attracted it?" Barbara felt a flicker of irritation. "No, there wasn't. I'm well aware of bear safety protocols. I've lived here for decades without incident." Of course. Wheeler said, his tone placating. "I'm just trying to understand the circumstances. Bear attacks are quite rare, especially in residential areas." As he spoke, Barbara couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't entirely believe her story. She leaned forward, wincing again at the pain in her ribs. "Officer Wheeler, I understand this might seem unusual, but I assure you, it happened exactly as I've described. I have the injuries to prove it." Wheeler nodded, but his skepticism was palpable. "May I see your injuries, Mrs. Hayes?" It could help with our assessment of the situation. Reluctantly, Barbara rolled up her sleeves, revealing the angry red scars that crisscrossed her arms. She then lifted the hem of her shirt slightly, showing the bruising on her ribs that was only now beginning to fade. Wheeler's eyes widened, slightly at the sight, but he quickly schooled his features back into a neutral expression. "Those are certainly significant injuries," he admitted, "but without any physical evidence at the scene, it's difficult to confirm that they were caused by a bear attack." Barbara felt her frustration mounting. What other explanation could there be? "Do you think I did this to myself?" Wheeler held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Not at all, Mrs. Hayes. We take all reports seriously. It's just that without any tracks, fur samples, or other physical evidence, there's only so much we can do." Barbara sat back in her chair, deflated. She had hoped that reporting the incident would lead to increased patrols or warnings for her neighbors. But it was becoming clear that her story was being treated as little more than an unsubstantiated claim. "So what happens now?" she asked, unable to keep the disappointment from her voice. Wheeler closed his notepad and offered what he probably thought was a reassuring smile. "We'll keep this report on file, of course. And we'll certainly keep an eye out for any bear activity in the area. But without more concrete evidence, I'm afraid there's not much else we can do at this point." Barbara nodded, feeling a mix of relief that the interview was over and frustration at its outcome. As she stood to leave, Wheeler spoke again. "Mrs. Hayes, I want you to know that we take wildlife encounters very seriously. But in cases like this, where it seems to have been a chance encounter with no lasting presence of the animal, our options are limited." His words, meant to be comforting, only served to underscore how little weight her experience carried in official terms. Barbara forced a polite smile. "I understand, Officer Wheeler. Thank you for your time." As she left the office, Barbara felt a profound sense of disappointment. She had hoped that reporting the incident would lead to some action, some acknowledgement of the danger that had intruded into her peaceful life. Instead, she was left with the impression that her harrowing experience had been reduced to a mere footnote in some bureaucratic file. Outside, she found her husband John waiting in the car. He looked up expectantly as she climbed in. "How did it go?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Barbara sighed, buckling her seatbelt. "About as well as could be expected, I suppose. Which is to say, not very well at all." As John pulled away from the curb, Barbara recounted her conversation with Officer Wheeler. John's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as she described the officer's skepticism. "That's ridiculous," he said, anger coloring his tone. "Has he seen your injuries? Does he think you made it all up?" Barbara patted her husband's arm, touched by his indignation on her behalf. "He saw the scars, John. But without any physical evidence at the scene, there's not much they can do. It's just my word against nothing, I suppose." They drove in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. As they neared their neighborhood, John spoke up again. "Maybe we should talk to the local paper, get your story out there, warn people about the danger." Barbara considered this for a moment before shaking her head. "I don't think that's a good idea, John. Can you imagine the headline? Local woman claims bear attack, officials skeptical. I'd rather not become the neighborhood crackpot." John chuckled despite himself. "You're right, as usual. But it doesn't seem fair, does it? You went through hell and now it's just nothing." "Not nothing," Barbara said softly, looking out at the familiar streets of their neighborhood. "I survived, that's not nothing." As they pulled into their driveway, Barbara caught sight of their neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, working in her garden. The elderly woman waved cheerfully, seemingly oblivious to the ordeal Barbara had been through. It struck Barbara then how little impact her experience had on the world around her. Life had gone on, unchanged, while her entire world had been turned upside down. Later that evening, as Barbara was preparing dinner, she heard the familiar sound of the local news coming from the living room. Curious, she made her way to the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "In local news," the anchor was saying, "wildlife officials remind residents to be bear aware as we enter the summer months. While bear attacks are rare, it's important to take precautions." Barbara listened as the anchor rattled off a list of bear safety tips, many of which she had followed religiously for years. There was no mention of her attack, no warning about increased bear activity in residential areas. She felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that she hadn't been turned into a local spectacle, disappointment that her experience hadn't led to increased awareness, and a lingering frustration at not being fully believed. As she turned back to the kitchen, Barbara caught sight of her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her bore the visible scars of her encounter, but there were invisible marks too. A new wariness in her eyes, a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. The bear may not have left any tracks in her yard, but it had certainly left its mark on her. And while the rest of the world might go on unaware, Barbara knew that she would carry the memory of that day with her always. It was a private battle scar, invisible to others but deeply significant to her. With a small determined nod to her reflection, Barbara returned to preparing dinner. The world might not acknowledge what she'd been through, but she knew the truth, and in the end, that would have to be enough. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Barbara's backyard as she stood on her back porch, a basket of laundry at her feet and a bear horn clutched tightly in her free hand. It had been 2 months since the attack, and this was the first time she had worked up the courage to hang laundry outside again. She took a deep breath, scanning the tree line with watchful eyes. The yard looked peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of dawn, but Barbara couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that crept over her every time she stepped outside. "You can do this, Barbara," she muttered to herself, gripping the bear horn a little tighter. "It's just laundry. You've done this 1,000 times before." With cautious steps, she made her way to the clothesline. Each movement was deliberate, her senses on high alert for any unusual sounds or movements. The clothespins clicked softly. As she began hanging sheets, the familiar routine both comforting and nerve-wracking. A twig snapped in the nearby woods and Barbara whirled around, her heart pounding. She raised the bear horn, ready to sound the alarm, but there was nothing there, just the gentle sway of branches in the morning breeze. She let out a shaky breath, lowering the horn. "Get a grip, Barbara," she chided herself. "Not every sound is a bear coming to get you." As she turned back to her task, she caught sight of her neighbor, Tom Johnson, watching her from his yard. The elderly man had been instrumental in saving her life during the attack, and his presence now was oddly reassuring. "Morning, Barbara," he called out, raising his coffee mug in greeting. "Good to see you out and about." Barbara managed a smile, though it felt strained. "Morning, Tom. Just trying to get back to normal." Tom nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's the spirit. Don't let one bad experience keep you from living your life." His words, well-intentioned as they were, struck a chord of frustration in Barbara. One bad experience? It had been so much more than that, but how could she explain the lingering fear, the way every rustle of leaves made her heart race? She turned back to her laundry, trying to focus on the task at hand. The repetitive motion of hanging clothes was soothing, and gradually, she felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. As she pinned up the last pillowcase, a flash of movement in her peripheral vision made her freeze. Slowly, she turned her head, her grip on the bear horn tightening once more. There, at the edge of the woods, stood a deer. Its large, liquid eyes regarded Barbara curiously for a moment before it bounded away into the underbrush. Barbara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The deer's appearance was a stark reminder of the beauty and unpredictability of nature, a nature she had once embraced without fear. As she made her way back to the porch, Barbara caught sight of her reflection in the kitchen window. The woman looking back at her seemed older somehow, more careworn, but there was a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Inside, she found her husband John at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and reading the morning paper. "How'd it go?" he asked, looking up as she entered. Barbara set the empty laundry basket down with a sigh. "Okay, I think. No bears, at least." John reached out and squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you, Barb. I know that wasn't easy." She smiled at him, grateful for his unwavering support. "It's getting easier. Slowly, but easier." As she poured herself a cup of coffee, Barbara's eye was caught by a small article on the back page of John's newspaper. The headline read, "Local Woman's Bear Encounter, a Reminder of Wildlife Safety." "John," she said, her voice tight, "what's that article about?" He glanced down at the paper, then back up at her, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "Oh, that. It's nothing, really. Just a small piece about bear safety." Barbara snatched up the paper, her eyes scanning the text rapidly. It was a brief article, barely more than a paragraph, mentioning a local retiree's chance encounter with a black bear and using it as a springboard to discuss wildlife safety tips. "Did you do this?" she asked, looking at John accusingly. He held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I may have mentioned something to Bill down at the paper. I thought people should know, Barb. It's important." Barbara felt a mix of emotions: embarrassment at being the subject of town gossip, frustration that her experience had been reduced to a cautionary tale, but also a small glimmer of validation. At least someone was taking her story seriously. "I wish you'd asked me first," she said finally, setting the paper down. John reached for her hand again. "I'm sorry, honey. I hated seeing you struggle with this alone. I thought if people knew, if they understood the danger." Barbara softened at the concern in his voice. "I know you meant well, it's just, I'm trying to move past this, John. I don't want to be known as the crazy bear lady." "You're not crazy," John said firmly. "You're the bravest person I know." As they sat in companionable silence, sipping their coffee, Barbara found her thoughts drifting to the future. The bear attack had changed her. There was no denying that. But perhaps it hadn't changed her in all the ways she'd feared. Yes, she was more cautious now, more aware of the potential dangers lurking in the wilderness she'd always loved. But she was also stronger, more resilient. She had faced one of nature's most formidable creatures, and survived. The sound of children's laughter drifted in through the open window, and Barbara stood to look out. A group of kids was riding bikes down the street, carefree and joyful in the morning sun. "You know," she said, turning back to John, "I think I might volunteer for that wildlife education program at the elementary school. Share some bear safety tips with the kids." John's face lit up with a smile. "I think that's a great idea, Barb." As the day wore on, Barbara found herself settling into a new rhythm. She still checked the tree line obsessively, still clutched her bear horn when she ventured into the yard. But there was a new determination in her steps, a resolve to not let fear dictate her life. That evening, as twilight fell, Barbara stood on her back porch once more. The laundry she'd hung that morning was dry now, swaying gently in the evening breeze. She breathed in the crisp Alaskan air, letting it fill her lungs and calm her nerves. In the fading light, she caught a glimpse of a dark shape moving through the distant trees. For a moment, her heart leapt into her throat, but then she straightened her shoulders, gripped her bear horn firmly, and stood her ground. Whether it was a bear or just a trick of the shadows didn't matter. What mattered was that Barbara Hayes was still here, still standing, still facing whatever came her way with courage and determination. As she turned to go inside, Barbara paused for one last look at her backyard. It was the same yard it had always been, a place of beauty and potential danger, of comfort and uncertainty. But now, it was also a testament to her resilience, a battleground where she had faced her fears and emerged victorious. She may never feel completely safe again, may always carry the memory of that terrifying encounter, but Barbara knew now that she was strong enough to handle whatever life, or nature, threw her way, and that knowledge, that hard-won confidence, was something no bear could ever take away from her. With a small, determined nod to herself, Barbara went inside, closing the door on the encroaching darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears to face, but for now she was home, she was safe, and she was undefeated. And that, she decided, was more than enough.